The federal agent's finger trembled on the trigger as he stared down the barrel at Frank Capone, Al's older brother, standing just 20 feet away in the dim Chicago streetlight. It was April 1st, 1924, and what started as a routine Election Day patrol had just turned into the most controversial shooting in Prohibition-era Chicago. When Agent David Hennessy pulled that trigger, he had no idea he was about to create one of the most enduring mysteries in gangster history. Because here's what nobody talks about in the history books. Frank Capone's body disappeared for over 6 hours before the Chicago Police Department officially arrived on scene. 6 hours, in the middle of one of the most heavily monitored elections in the city's history. And what happened during those missing hours would spark conspiracy theories that persist to this very day.
Today, you're going to discover the real story behind Frank Capone's death, the federal cover-up that followed, and the shocking truth about what really happened to his body during those crucial missing hours. Make sure you're subscribed, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about the Capone organization and how deep federal corruption actually ran in 1920 Chicago. To understand how we got to that fatal moment on April 1st, 1924, you need to understand the powder keg that Chicago had become by the mid-1920s. Prohibition wasn't just a law, it was a declaration of war between the federal government and every major city in America. And nowhere was that war more brutal than in Chicago, where Al Capone was rapidly building an empire that would make him the most powerful criminal in American history. But Al wasn't the only Capone brother making waves. Frank Capone, 2 years older than Al, was the political mastermind of the family operation. While Al handled the muscle and the media attention, Frank worked behind the scenes, bribing aldermen, fixing elections, and building the political machine that would protect their bootlegging empire. Frank understood something that many gangsters missed. You don't just need to control the streets, you need to control the ballot box. By 1924, the Capone organization had their hooks deep into Cicero, Illinois, a working-class suburb just west of Chicago proper. Cicero was perfect for their operations, close enough to Chicago to access the markets and supply lines, but far enough away to avoid the heaviest federal scrutiny. The town had about 60,000 residents, mostly Eastern European immigrants who worked in the local factories. These were people who minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about where their neighborhood saloon got its whiskey. Frank Capone had spent months preparing for the April 1st municipal elections. He knew that if they could install their candidates as mayor and city council members, Cicero would become an untouchable fortress for their operations. The current mayor, Joseph Klenha, was already in their pocket, but several reform candidates were threatening to upset their carefully constructed political machine. Frank wasn't about to let that happen. The federal government, meanwhile, was getting increasingly frustrated with their inability to crack the Capone organization. J. Edgar Hoover was still a few years away from building the FBI into the powerhouse it would become, but federal agents were already working overtime to find any angle they could use against the Capones. Election fraud seemed like their best bet. If they could prove the Capones were stealing elections, they might be able to build a case that would stick. Federal agent David Hennessy had been tracking Frank Capone's activities for months. Hennessy was a 15-year veteran of federal law enforcement, originally from Boston, with a reputation for being both fearless and by the book. His superiors had specifically assigned him to monitor the Cicero elections because they knew Frank would be personally involved in any vote manipulation efforts. What made the situation even more volatile was the presence of the Chicago Police Department. Officially, Chicago PD had no jurisdiction in Cicero. But unofficially, many Chicago cops were on the Capone payroll, and Frank had arranged for several dozen off-duty Chicago officers to work as election monitors in Cicero. These weren't legitimate poll watchers. They were armed enforcers whose job was to intimidate voters and make sure the right candidates won. The morning of April 1st dawned gray and cold, typical Chicago spring weather. Frank Capone woke up in his modest apartment on the South Side, kissed his wife goodbye, and told her he'd be home late. He had no way of knowing he'd never see her again. Frank arrived in Cicero around 8 a.m., just as the polls were opening. He was dressed conservatively in a dark suit and overcoat, trying to blend in with the legitimate political observers. But Frank Capone was not a man who blended in easily.
At 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and piercing dark eyes, he commanded attention wherever he went. More importantly, everyone in Cicero knew exactly who he was and what he represented. Agent Hennessy had positioned himself across the street from the main polling station on Roosevelt Road. He'd been watching Frank move from precinct to precinct, always accompanied by 2 or 3 tough-looking men in expensive overcoats. What nobody knew was that Hennessy had received specific orders from his supervisor that morning. If Frank Capone attempted to interfere with the voting process, he was authorized to make an arrest using whatever force necessary. The first sign of trouble came around 2 p.m. Hennessy watched as Frank approached an elderly Polish immigrant who was having trouble reading his ballot.
Frank leaned in close, pointing at specific names on the ballot, clearly telling the man how to vote. This was exactly the kind of direct election interference that federal agents had been waiting to witness. Hennessy radioed for backup, but the response crackled back with static and interference. Later investigation would reveal that someone had been jamming federal radio frequencies throughout Cicero that day, though it was never proven who was responsible. Around 3:30 p.m., the situation escalated dramatically. A group of reform voters had gathered outside the Roosevelt Road polling station, complaining loudly that Capone's men were preventing them from casting their ballots. Frank emerged from the polling station, flanked by 4 men who were clearly armed.
Witnesses later testified that Frank walked directly up to the group of complainers and told them in no uncertain terms that they needed to leave immediately if they knew what was good for them. This was Agent Hennessy's moment. He'd witnessed direct voter intimidation by Frank Capone, and he had federal authority to make an arrest. But here's where the story gets complicated, because what happened next depends entirely on whose version you believe. According to Hennessy's official report, he approached Frank Capone and identified himself as a federal agent. He ordered Frank to disperse his men and cease interfering with the election. Frank, according to Hennessy, responded by reaching inside his overcoat. Fearing that Frank was going for a weapon, Hennessy drew his service revolver and ordered Frank to keep his hands visible. But witnesses told a very different story.
Several voters who were present that day later testified that Hennessy never identified himself as a federal agent. They claimed he simply walked up to Frank and started shouting orders. More disturbing, multiple witnesses swore that Frank Capone never reached for anything. His hands, they insisted, remained visible at all times. What everyone agreed on was what happened next. The confrontation moved from the front of the polling station toward a narrow alley between 2 buildings. Frank Capone was walking backward, his hands raised, with Agent Hennessy pointing a gun at his chest. Frank kept saying something, but the witnesses were too far away to hear what it was. And then, Hennessy pulled the trigger. If you're enjoying this story, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people discover these incredible untold stories. And stick around, because what happens next is absolutely wild. The gunshot echoed off the brick buildings like a thunderclap. Frank Capone stumbled backward, clutching his chest, a look of shock and disbelief on his face. He tried to say something, his lips moving silently, before he collapsed onto the dirty pavement of the alley. Agent Hennessy stood over Frank's body for what witnesses estimated was nearly a full minute, his smoking gun still in his hand. The federal agent's face was pale, and several people later testified that he appeared to be in shock at what he'd just done. This wasn't some hardened killer. This was a career law enforcement officer who had just killed a man for the first time in his 15-year career. But here's where the story takes its most mysterious turn. Agent Hennessy holstered his weapon and immediately began walking away from the scene.
He didn't check Frank's pulse. He didn't call for medical assistance. He didn't secure the scene or begin taking witness statements. He simply walked away, leaving Frank Capone's body bleeding out in that narrow Cicero alley. The first person to reach Frank's body was a local shopkeeper named Giuseppe Torino, who had witnessed the shooting from his storefront window. Torino later testified that he knelt beside Frank and checked for signs of life. Frank was still breathing, barely, with blood spreading across the front of his white shirt. Torino shouted for someone to call a doctor, but in 1924 Cicero, medical help wasn't exactly quick to arrive. What happened next is where the official story and the witness accounts diverge so dramatically that they might as well be describing two completely different events. According to the federal report filed later that evening, Chicago police arrived on scene within minutes of the shooting and immediately secured Frank Capone's body. The report states that Frank was pronounced dead at the scene by a police physician and that his body was transported to the Cook County morgue within an hour of the shooting. But every single civilian witness told investigators a completely different story. They swore that no police officers arrived at the scene for hours after the shooting. They watched as Frank Capone's body lay in that alley, covered only by Giuseppe Torino's coat, while a crowd of curious onlookers gradually gathered. Some witnesses estimated that Frank's body remained in the alley for at least 4 hours before any official personnel arrived.
Even more mysteriously, several witnesses claimed that Frank Capone's body disappeared entirely for a period of time before police officially arrived. Maria Kowalski, who lived in an apartment directly overlooking the alley, swore in a sworn affidavit that she watched 3 men in expensive overcoats arrive around 6 p.m. These men, she claimed, loaded Frank's body into the back of a black sedan and drove away. According to Maria, the body was gone for approximately 2 hours before the same black sedan returned and the same 3 men placed Frank's body back in the exact same position where he had fallen. Giuseppe Torino corroborated Maria's account. He told federal investigators that he had remained near Frank's body for the entire afternoon, refusing to leave out of respect for the dead man.
He swore that around 6 p.m., 3 well-dressed men approached him and politely but firmly asked him to leave the area for his own safety. When Torino returned to his shop around 8 p.m., Frank's body was gone. When he checked again around 10 p.m., the body had mysteriously reappeared. The implications of these witness statements were staggering. If Frank Capone's body had indeed been moved and then returned to the scene, it meant that someone with significant resources and organization had intervened in what was supposed to be a federal crime scene. But who would have both the motivation and the capability to orchestrate such an operation? The most obvious suspect was Al Capone himself. Al had been in Chicago that day, managing other aspects of their Election Day operations.
When word reached him that Frank had been shot, Al would have had both the motive and the resources to retrieve his brother's body. The Capone organization employed dozens of men who would have followed Al's orders without question, and they certainly had access to the kind of expensive sedan that witnesses described. But why would Al want to move Frank's body? The most likely explanation was that Frank was carrying something that Al couldn't afford to let fall into federal hands. In 1924, Frank Capone was the political coordinator for one of the largest criminal organizations in American history. He would have been carrying names, addresses, payoff schedules, and other information that could have destroyed their entire operation. There was also the possibility that Frank had been carrying a significant amount of cash.
Election Day operations required substantial bribes for poll workers, election judges, and local officials. Frank might have been carrying tens of thousands of dollars in small bills, money that Al would have wanted to recover before federal agents could seize it as evidence. Another theory suggested that the body was moved for a more sinister reason, to alter the crime scene itself. If Agent Hennessy had shot Frank Capone in cold blood, without justification, physical evidence on Frank's body might have contradicted Hennessy's official account. Moving the body would have given someone the opportunity to plant a weapon on Frank or otherwise manipulate the evidence to support the federal agent's version of events. When Chicago police finally arrived at the scene around 10:30 p.m., they found Frank Capone's body exactly where Agent Hennessy claimed to have left it.
Frank was lying on his back in the narrow alley, his arms at his sides, wearing the same dark suit and overcoat he'd worn that morning. There was a single gunshot wound to his chest, and a .38 caliber bullet was later recovered from his body during the autopsy. But the police also found something that hadn't been mentioned in any of the witness statements: a loaded .45 caliber pistol in Frank's right hand. This discovery was crucial because it provided justification for Agent Hennessy's use of deadly force. If Frank had indeed been armed and had drawn his weapon, then Hennessy's actions could be considered a legitimate case of self-defense. However, several witnesses immediately disputed the presence of the pistol. Giuseppe Torino, who had been the first person to reach Frank's body,
swore that Frank's hands had been empty when he collapsed.
Maria Kowalski, watching from her apartment window, testified that she had observed Frank's body for hours and had never seen a weapon. Most damning of all, several witnesses stated that Frank's right hand had been covered in blood from his chest wound when he fell, but when police arrived, his right hand was clean and gripping the pistol. The autopsy, conducted the following day by Cook County Medical Examiner Dr. William McCarthy, raised even more questions. Dr. McCarthy noted that the gunshot wound was consistent with a shot fired from close range, probably no more than 6 feet. The bullet had entered Frank's chest at a slightly upward angle, suggesting that the shooter had been positioned lower than the victim when the shot was fired. More significantly, Dr. McCarthy found no gunpowder residue on Frank's hands, which would have been present if Frank had recently fired a weapon.
The .45 caliber pistol found in Frank's hand had not been fired recently, and there were no fingerprints on the weapon other than Frank's own. To experienced investigators, this suggested that the gun had been placed in Frank's hand after he was already dead or unconscious. The federal investigation into the shooting was completed with unusual speed. Within 48 hours of Frank Capone's death, Agent David Hennessy was cleared of any wrongdoing. The official report concluded that Hennessy had acted in self-defense when Frank Capone drew a weapon during a lawful arrest. Case closed. But the speed of the investigation and the contradictory evidence left many people convinced that a cover-up was in progress. Federal agents in 1924 were under enormous pressure to show results in their fight against organized crime.
A dead Capone brother was exactly the kind of high-profile victory that could advance careers and secure additional funding from Washington. There was also the uncomfortable reality that Agent Hennessy had violated several federal protocols during the incident. He had approached a dangerous suspect without backup. He had failed to properly identify himself as a federal agent. He had left the scene immediately after the shooting without securing evidence or taking witness statements. In any normal case, these violations would have resulted in serious disciplinary action, if not criminal charges. The fact that Hennessy faced no consequences whatsoever suggested that his superiors were more interested in protecting their agent than in conducting a thorough investigation.
This was particularly troubling given the witness testimony that contradicted almost every aspect of Hennessy's official account. Al Capone's reaction to his brother's death was swift and brutal. Within a week of Frank's funeral, 3 Chicago police officers who had been present in Cicero on Election Day were found dead in various locations around the city. All 3 had been shot execution style, and all 3 had been known to work closely with federal agents in their investigations of the Capone organization. Al never publicly claimed responsibility for these killings, but everyone in Chicago understood the message. Frank Capone's death would not go unanswered, and anyone who had cooperated with federal agents in the cover-up would pay the price. The mysterious disappearance and reappearance of Frank's body remained an open question for decades.
In 1954, exactly 30 years after Frank's death, a former Capone organization member named Vincent Drucci gave a deathbed confession to a Catholic priest in which he claimed to have been one of the 3 men who moved Frank's body on April 1, 1924. According to Drucci's confession, Al Capone had indeed ordered the body's removal, but not for the reasons that most people suspected. Frank hadn't been carrying money or incriminating documents. Instead, he had been wearing a wire recording device, one of the first such devices ever used in law enforcement. The federal agents had apparently been trying to gather evidence of election fraud by having Frank unknowingly record his own conversations with poll workers and election officials. If Drucci's confession was accurate, he would explain why Agent Hennessy had been so confident in approaching Frank alone.
Hennessy would have known that Frank was wired and that backup agents were monitoring his conversations from a nearby location. It would also explain why the federal investigation was concluded so quickly. If Frank had been working as an informant, his death would have been an embarrassing failure that federal agents would have wanted to cover up as quickly as possible. But Drucci's confession raised as many questions as it answered. If Frank had been working with federal agents, why had Hennessy shot him? Had something gone wrong with the operation? Had Frank tried to back out of his cooperation agreement at the last minute? Or had the entire story been an elaborate setup designed to eliminate Frank while providing Agent Hennessy with eagle cover? These questions were never answered because Vincent Drucci died less than 24 hours after making his confession, and the priest who heard it was bound by the seal of confession never to reveal its contents publicly. The confession only became known decades later when the priest's personal papers were donated to the Chicago Historical Society after his death in 1978. Agent David Hennessy continued his career in federal law enforcement for another 20 years after Frank Capone's death. He was promoted several times and eventually became a supervisor in the Chicago field office. But according to colleagues who worked with him in later years, Hennessy was never quite the same after April 1, 1924. He became increasingly paranoid about his personal safety and frequently requested transfers to cases that didn't involve organized crime.
In 1944, exactly 20 years after Frank's death, Hennessy suffered what his family described as a nervous breakdown. He was found in his Chicago apartment, sitting in a chair and staring at a loaded .38 caliber revolver, the same type of weapon he had used to kill Frank Capone. Hennessy was committed to a psychiatric hospital where he remained for the rest of his life. He died in 1963, taking whatever secrets he knew about Frank Capone's death with him to the grave. The truth about what really happened in that Cicero alley on April 1, 1924, may never be fully known. What we do know is that Frank Capone's death marked a turning point in the federal government's war against organized crime. It demonstrated that federal agents were willing to use deadly force against gangsters, even in ambiguous circumstances.
It also showed that the line between law enforcement and criminal behavior was often thinner than the public wanted to believe. Frank Capone was buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Chicago, just a few miles from where he died. His grave is marked with a simple headstone that gives no indication of the dramatic circumstances of his death or the enduring mystery surrounding it. But every year on April 1st, someone leaves fresh flowers on Frank's grave. The identity of this mysterious mourner has never been discovered, but the flowers appear without fail, a reminder that some secrets from the Prohibition era continue to cast shadows nearly a century later. If this story amazed you, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. We're bringing you these deep dives into history's most fascinating moments every single week. Drop a comment and let me know what you thought. Do you think Agent Hennessy was justified in shooting Frank Capone? Was Frank really working as a federal informant, or was that just another layer of the cover-up? What would you have done in Hennessy's position? And next week, we're covering the mysterious disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa and the 3 witnesses who saw something they weren't supposed to see. You won't want to miss it.